So I want to introduce the first speaker, Erin Hanan from the University of Reno. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to be talking a bit about a few different things that I do in my lab, which focus on how fire, can you hear me okay? Great. On how fire regimes are changing in Western North America and how that is influencing both biogeochemical and eco-hydrologic processes. So this photo was taken in Santa Barbara County following the Jesus, a couple of years after the Jesus fire. And it may be a little hard to see in the photo, but this is a watershed overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And so fires can have really large impacts on the ecosystems that burn and can also really impact streams, reservoirs, and the nearshore marine environment. Globally, many ecosystems are dominated by fire, and that's just illustrated in this, this figure from a 2013 paper, where the red color just corresponds with a metric for fire activity. And so because so many systems are dominated by fire, it's really important to understand how fires are going to influence both biogeochemical and eco-hydrologic processes, which can ultimately influence many different ecosystems around the globe. I work in dryland ecosystems in Western North America primarily. And so some of the key systems that I work in are California chaparral, mixed conifer forests in the northern Rockies and elsewhere, and also the Sierra Nevada and Great Basin, so both shrubland and forest systems. So fire is a major restructuring force in dryland systems. It causes massive movement of materials through erosion, through smoke, through leaching, runoff, etc. So fires release nutrients and carbon, which can be transported down slope through wind and through water. So that includes materials that are in plant biomass, litter, and surface soil organic matter. And so those materials can be transported from pretty far inland to way offshore. And I think that's really well illustrated in this image here from NASA. This was taken during the 2003, what they call the firestorm in California. And that's where a lot of the state of California was on fire. And so you can see materials being carried very far offshore. So in addition to the immediate effects of fire, water can be a really powerful vehicle for post-fire export. And so that's illustrated in these two images here. On the left is following the debris flow that occurred in Montecito after the Thomas fire. And this was an event where a lot of residents thought the danger was over after the fire occurred. But about 3 weeks later, there was a rainstorm, very intense rainstorm that lasted only about 20 minutes. And that caused this massive movement of material downslope and just absolutely destroyed the local community. And so on the right, this photo was following the recent Dixie fire and another debris flow that occurred during an atmospheric river event. So even in the absence of these very extreme situations, these massive debris flows, erosion and leaching can really threaten water quality and aquatic ecosystems. And so here what I'm showing is a conceptual figure just illustrating how export can occur in these events that correspond with winter precipitation. And so export can last for months to years, and that is going to depend on how severely a fire impacted the ecosystem or watershed and how quickly the vegetation and the system is recovering. And so one of the key questions that I ask in my research is, how does fire affect ecosystem and watershed function? And the key function that I'm going to talk about today is nitrogen cycling and retention. So this photo I took in Santa Barbara following the Raleigh fire. This fire burned in the backcountry above Lake Kachuma. And so during this fire, a lot of residents and resource managers were really worried that runoff from these burned slopes could end up affecting or devastating the local drinking water supply. So Lake Kachuma is the main reservoir for the city of Santa Barbara. So fires, although they release a lot of material that can be carried away during fire, at the same time they deposit ammonium and readily decomposable organic nitrogen on soil surfaces with ash. that's illustrated in a shrubland on top and a forest on the bottom here. Following fire, vegetation recovery can rapidly mobilize this available nitrogen and serve to prevent a lot of continued leaching or reduce those pulses of N to streams that you see post-fire. And so the extent of nitrogen export that you have in the years following fire is in large part a function of how quickly microbes are metabolizing nitrogen into forms that readily dissolve or leach, and then how quickly recovering plants are taking that up. So just starting with the first part of that equation, one thing that we ask in my lab is what mechanisms control nitrogen cycling following fire. And so this is an older paper from Santa Barbara Chaparral system where we found that following fire, nitrification was really enhanced. This was 2 years after that Jesus fire that I mentioned. And so nitrification is potentially problematic because nitrate is very mobile in the soil and can readily leach. Similarly, this is from a mixed conifer forest in the Sierra Nevada. We also found enhanced nitrification. This was a project carried out by a graduate student in my lab. But what was interesting here is that there was a non-monotonic relationship with fire severity. So it wasn't the highest severity burns where we found enhanced nitrification. It was actually in the low severity sites. And so a possible issue here is that fire severity is a very convenient way at estimating how a fire has impacted ecosystems because we can readily measure fire severity with remote sensing over large areas. But fire severity is a metric of how fire has transformed the above ground environment. It does not always have a one-to-one relationship with what's going on below ground. So another thing that we are working on is developing more direct ways to quantify fire or heating regimes that occur beneath the soil surface. And so this is a project that was carried out by a former master's student in my lab, Mary Brady, and in collaboration with Matt Dickinson at the Forest Service and Jessica Meisel at Michigan State University. So we developed a model called the Soil Heating and Fire Model, or SHE-FIRE. And the way this works is we use what we call an eye stake that has eye button temperature sensors that are installed into the soil during a fire. And those collect time series temperature data at 3 discrete depths in the soil. And so we then feed that into a model that interpolates and extrapolates temperatures through any depth over time, and we can characterize different aspects of the heating regime. So what was the maximum temperature? What was the time at maximum temperature? Things like that. And then the second part of the model is linking these heating regimes with below ground responses. And so this is just an example showing different heating regimes at 5 and 10 centimeter depths, and then the response of partridge pea seeds. So showing how the heating regime influenced mortality. And so this is an ongoing project. So this is now being continued by Elena Cox, who is a PhD student in my lab. She is expanding the model to try to better include the mechanisms that are transforming carbon and nitrogen cycling and processes post-fire. And so we're doing this through a combination of burn table experiments, which is illustrated here, and also field measurements where we have tons of temperature sensors. You can see we have radiometers, we have a FLIR camera, we have thermocouples and eye buttons at 5 different depths inside calorimeters beneath the burn table. And then we have fuels, both DUF if you're a forester, or the O horizon if you're a soil scientist, and litter trying to mimic a natural depth. And we ignite a fire and let that cross over our calorimeters. And so now we have the heating regime within those canisters. We also had some temperature sensitive paints that you can see on the little tags. So we're trying to get flame temperature, surface temperature, and temperature at multiple depths. And then we will be quantifying how that influenced soil microbial processes, carbon cycling, nitrogen cycling, and so on. So that is ongoing work. I won't have time for you to see the whole video, but so this model is really helpful for understanding how fire is transforming these fine scale processes. But another thing that I'm really interested in is how does this scale up to influence watershed scale processes and how nitrogen or carbon is exported at watershed scales. And so for that, we need other tools. We need process-based models. The model that I work with is the Regional Hydroecologic Simulation System, or RESIS. RESIS takes spatial data on soils, vegetation, topography, etc., and uses that to generate a watershed. And then we feed climate inputs into these process-based submodels that interact to influence both hydrologic processes, vegetation processes, and biogeochemical processes. So it's explicitly modeling hydrologic flow through a spatially explicit watershed, and the soil moisture and hydrology is tightly coupled with biogeochemical processes. So they're controlled by water availability. And so this is a really good model for simulating processes in mountainous systems or drylands where these processes are water limited. And so there's many different outputs that RESIS generates. A lot of them relate to carbon and nitrogen cycling in soils, vegetation across the watershed. We simulate stream flow and things like nitrogen or DOC export. And so again, focusing on nitrogen, I did a modeling experiment where I asked, okay, well, what happens when fire occurs under different sort of intermediate term weather patterns or climate patterns? So like, what happens if fire follows drought? Or what happens if following fire, there's a drought? And so I did this in a very simple way where I took the climate data before or after a fire and replaced it with either the wettest or driest years on record. And so what I'm showing here is 2 years before and 2 years after fire. And I'm showing here the simulations where it was wet prior to fire, wet after fire, or dry prior to fire and wet after fire. And you can see this initial pulse of nitrate that occurred in that first post-fire year. So what was kind of interesting and surprising is that here I'm showing the two simulations where fire is followed by drought. So not only was there a large pulse of nitrates in that first year, we actually had a pulse the second year, a much more substantial pulse the second year. And that was because plant recovery was really slowed by drought. And so while dry conditions can reduce the amount of nitrate that is flowing through the system, microbial processes tend to be less sensitive to drought than vegetation. And so vegetation recovery was suppressed when the fire was followed by drought, which allowed more export to occur. So in summary, wet conditions following fire, there was more nitrogen uptake. And when you had drought post-fire, there was a lot more export. Again, because microbial processes are less sensitive to drought than vegetation. So although I'm able to kind of simulate the mechanisms that might control nitrogen export following fire, there's a lot of uncertainty in these models. Like, our models don't do a really great job of capturing observed nitrate pulses. And so that's another sort of avenue of research in my lab, is how can we improve models to better capture these post-fire end pulses or end pulses in drylands in general. And so one thing is that a lot of our theory about nitrogen export was developed in these mesic systems where the growing season corresponds with the summer precipitation. But in a dryland or in a Mediterranean type system, you often have winter precipitation when plants are less active. And so we can have pulses of nitrogen that occur in drylands even if you don't have a nitrogen saturated condition. And so during the wet season, you can have this hydrologic connectivity where plant roots have access to mineralized and mobilized nitrogen. But during the dry season, these hydrologic connections break down and resources can become compartmentalized. So you can still have microbial nitrogen cycling in these hydrologically disconnected microsites, so it's happening at a very slow rate, but this can enable nitrogen to accumulate in these microsites. And then when you have winter precipitation, which reestablishes hydrologic connection, a lot of times that nitrogen can be exported before recovering plants are able to take it out. And so a postdoc in my lab, Ren in the center photo, has been working to develop algorithms for incorporating these biogeochemical hotspots in uses. And this is something that's been a big challenge in the past because a lot of these watershed scale models are working at typically a 30-meter pixel resolution. So how do we parameterize or represent a hotspot spatially within a 30-meter pixel? It's nearly impossible. And so what Ming is doing is representing these hotspots aspatially within 30-meter patches. And so this includes parameters that influence when the amount of water that would be required for hydrologic connectivity to reestablish. And so what I'm showing here is just some preliminary results from a sensitivity analysis where we were looking at the sensitivity of nitrification, denitrification, and stream flow nitrates, the parameters that are controlling the reconnection or hydrologic reconnectivity. And so what you can see is there's this trade-off that occurs between denitrification and stream flow nitrate. And so when that parameter value is low, so in other words, when it takes only a small storm for hydrologic connectivity to reestablish, you can end up, that would favor a lower amount of denitrification and more stream flow nitrate export. And so in general, by representing hotspots, we're seeing there are situations where this can increase the amount of export, but that's really dependent on these very fine scale physical mechanisms that control how water and moisture moves through the soil at very fine scales. And that's an area where there's still a lot of uncertainty. So fire is a key process connecting both terrestrial and aquatic systems in both forest and shrublands. But to predict how fire is going to affect aquatic systems, it also requires understanding how fire regimes are changing. So I'm not going to have time to go into a ton of detail on this, but I just wanted to quickly mention some other research in my lab where I am participating in model development and taking advantage of rhesus model improvements that are basically linking the ecohydrologic model to a model for fire spread and fire effects. And this is really unique in that it enables us to capture this full system of feedbacks influencing long-term fire behavior. So the ecohydrologic model grows fuels on the landscape that feeds into a model for fire spread, feeds into a model for fire effects, which then updates post-fire stand structure, influences fuel loadings, and therefore future fire. And so this is capturing feedbacks that a lot of other models are not currently capturing. And so just very quickly, so this is results from an analysis I did trying to understand how climate change and fire suppression are influencing fire activity in two watersheds in the inland Northwest. So Johnson Creek is a watershed in the Idaho batholith. It's a little bit more music than Trail Creek, which is in the northern Rocky Mountains, and that is a semi-arid watershed. And you can see, so basically this is changes in burn probability due to climate change. And you can see climate change had like basically opposite effects in these two watersheds. So in Johnson Creek, climate change really increased burn probability, whereas, and I should mention that this is historical climate change, not projecting into the future. And in Trail Creek, we actually saw a decrease in burn probability. So why is that? Johnson Creek is a relatively music watershed. This is what we would call a flammability limited watershed. There's plenty of fuel. There's always enough fuel to carry a fire, but fire is limited by moisture. And so climate change is drying the system and enabling larger and more severe fires to spread. Trail Creek, on the other hand, is a mostly fuel-limited watershed. It's dry, there's not a lot of fuel loading. And with climate change, there's actually a decrease in plant productivity and a decrease in burn probability. So happy to talk about that more later. But in general, what we're seeing is that both fire behavior or fire regimes and biogeochemical responses to fire are really dependent on these complex processes that vary along these gradients of aridity across different Western North American ecosystems. And so to be able to predict how things like climate change or management are going to influence solute export, we have to account for all of these very complex processes. And to do that, we need models. But for models to be reliable, they need to be continually confronted with observations and empirical data. And so that's something we're continuing to do in my lab, but there's a ton of uncertainty, and I will finish there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Erin. Are there any questions? I see a couple hands.
Hi, thanks, Blake Clark from NASA. So do you think that these nitrogen carbon runoff models that link to fire are mature enough to be linked with, say, like a coastal ocean model that could incorporate the effects into ocean biogeochemistry?
That's a great question. I think there is still a lot of room for model improvements. And so currently with RESIS, we can simulate DOC export, but it's done very simplistically. And that component of the model has not been well tested. The nitrogen component of the model is a little bit further along. And so I have seen papers where model DOC has done an adequate job of projecting export, but my feeling is that the model needs a lot more testing and improvement in order to ultimately be linked with more ocean process models.
Jeff Krause, Delta Mountain Sea Lab. Is following up. Very interesting. I'm an oceanographer, so I'm going back to that shot you showed of California basically on fire.
Yeah.
From a nitrogen standpoint, it seems like upwelling's going to dominate coastal processes in the system, but especially on the central coast, between Point Conception up to Monterey Bay, it's really narrow, and so there's no fire in the upwell water. So, I mean, you have these massive plumes. Are they delivering maybe iron or metals to the surface waters? And if so, is that particular material soluble? And could that be a link between, these fire events way inshore and stimulated stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's getting a little bit outside of my expertise. I think that there are people in Santa Barbara associated with the long-term ecological research site there that are probably studying that process, but I can't speak to how much material is being transported in the smoke. Yeah, thank you.
I'll leave it.
Well, Elliot White, Stanford University. I don't know a whole lot about fire, but I know there are crown fires and also like forest floor fires. Is there a difference in kind of the nitrogen loading and fluxes depending on crown versus floor? And then also, can you comment on the distribution of crown versus floor over time?
Yeah, great question. So, yes, absolutely. Crown fires are often going to consume more material, and there's potential to release more nitrogen. The amount that is left behind and continues to cycle post-fire is really, really variable. So in a lot of these forested ecosystems in the West, nitrogen cycling is very tight. And so even when you have a crown fire and that leaves behind some substantial amount of ash, a lot of that ash will blow away and you can return to a very low nitrogen availability very quickly. Chaparral ecosystems that burn under a crown fire regime tend to release also a lot of nitrogen, and that nitrogen may continue to cycle for years after fire. So it really varies. Crown fires are becoming more common and more severe with climate change, and this is an area where it's actually really difficult to model and predict. Fire models model surface fire, and we can model passive crown fire where fire spreads from the surface into the canopy, but what we their models do not do a good job of modeling things like active ground fire, where you have a heightened event and fire traveling from ground to ground. So yes, it's increasing, and we're working on improving the way we represent that, but again, still a lot of uncertainty.
Well, I first want to say thank you for inviting me to give a talk as part of this group. I'm really excited to be here and see all of you in person. So I want to kind of jump right in, and my research focus is mostly on organic matter dynamics, and I'm specifically going to be talking about organic matter dynamics and black carbon dynamics that happen post-fire. So when you have a burn event like this, you have a lot of biomass, biomolecules like lignin, cellulose that exist in your vegetation. When you burn it, you can form different molecules just through the process of charring. And at really high temperatures, you can form these polykondensed aromatic structures. These are just exemplary molecules. They don't represent all of them, but it gives you a sense on a molecular level what these molecules look like. And so this kind of high temperature polykondensed aromatic material is what we term black carbon, although we'll talk about our methods for quantifying this black carbon are sort of evolving as science continues to evolve as well. So during this charring process, fire will, just fire alone will simply alter the reactivity and cycling of the organic carbon. When you're changing the molecular structure of these biomolecules, you are fundamentally changing their kind of properties and ability to react under certain conditions in the environment. So simply through the act of charring, you're increasing the resistance of organic matter to microbial breakdown. And so if you look at like the suite of toast that you might get for breakfast, a lot of you might be very interested in, eating this lightly toasted bread, whereas if you were handed a piece of, really blackened toast, you probably would not want to eat it, although I know there are some people who really enjoy charred bread. So in this, microbes behave like this as well. I'm more for the ability to consume the organic molecules themselves and energy dynamics, but simply through the formation of this black carbon, which is represented here by the dark toast, it moves organic carbon from short-term cycling to long-term storage under the same kind of environmental conditions. And we know that black carbon can stick around. This charcoal material sticks around for a very, very long time because the black carbon fraction is usually older, i.e. more radiocarbon depleted than bulk organic carbon in a lot of different environmental areas. So this represents essentially various reservoirs of black carbon and fluxes of black carbon in the environment. And we know through previous studies that black carbon in alluvial deposits can be thousands of years old. So that means that when you burn material on the landscape, it can take a very, very long time for that charred material to even mobilize to coastal environments. And similarly, black carbon or these little bits of charcoal have been identified at major junctions in Earth's history. So this is an example of charcoal that exists in sediments at the Paleocene-Eocene boundary. That's so this stuff has been preserved for millions and millions of years. So it's really refractory. And we know that our condensed aromatic material in the deep ocean is quite old. It's much older than the bulk DOC that it exists within. So this gives you a sense of kind of the recalcitrance of this this fraction. So what I really want to kind of hit on in this talk is that not all carbon is created equal. So looking at bulk organic carbon properties is important, but also kind of within the compound class, how does fire and the interaction with hydrologic events transform the mobilization mechanisms for this material as well. And so I was part of a recent project where we were kind of synthesizing some ideas, and it is posed kind of on a global scale that the formation of black carbon during fire might actually mitigate the fire-derived CO2 emissions. So we might also all be familiar with this kind of positive climate fire feedback cycle where you burn material on the land. Climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of forest fires in some areas. It disturbs the landscape, but you're also releasing a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which contributes to global warming, which increases further climate change and forest fires, and the cycle continues. But there's also this kind of secondary loop, this negative feedback loop that's happening as well, where with these forest fires, they're also producing a lot of charcoal, which, as I mentioned, is a lot more biorecalcitrant compared to bulk organic carbon or your kind of the unburned material. So if you're increasing black carbon production, which certainly is kind of a smaller fraction of the material that's burned, but if that stuff sits around in the environment for a very long time, it can be an effective tool or mechanism for sequestration. And so kind of this negative feedback loop is where we have a lot of questions, and it's difficult because Erin so nicely introduced all of the little mechanisms that come into play when we're trying to assess not just black carbon formation, but also mobilization post-fire. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. Because one of my research interests is to determine how much of this organic carbon and black carbon leaks out of soils after these fire events and with hydrologic events. And so are these mobilization mechanisms different, say for the dissolved phase, so the stuff that's soluble, versus mechanisms, versus the export of black carbon and organic material in a particulate fraction. So now we're dealing with, there might be two different mobilization mechanisms depending on how big your molecules are, how big your pieces are post-fire. So I want to take a moment to describe how do we measure black carbon. There's a lot of different definitions and a lot of different methods. So I just want to introduce you to the one that we use in our lab, which is called the BPCA method. So we collect a whole water sample, we filter it, and then after filtering, you're operationally defining a particulate fraction, which sticks on your filter, and the dissolved fraction, which goes through the filter. And then the stuff that goes through the filter are dissolved organic matter. We extract and concentrate using solid phase extraction techniques. Both of these fractions, black carbon, these condensed aromatic molecules are ubiquitous in all of DOM, or all organic matter matrices that we've seen thus far. So both of these size fractions contain condensed aromatic black carbon that form benzene polycarboxylic acids, which are these two little molecules I'm showing on the left-hand side, through nitric acid oxidation. So these are essentially degradation products of this condensed aromatic parent molecules, which vary quite a bit in their composition. So after we form BPCAs or produce BPCAs through this oxidation process, in our lab we use HPLC. There are other chromatographic separation methods that exist that other folks use. But then we quantify them, and then we kind of reconstruct how much black carbon was there in our original sample. Our understanding of BPCAs has evolved a lot over the last decade or two. So I can say with some confidence that BPCAs represent this really photolabile or very aromatic molecules fraction. They're highly biorefractory, so as long as, if they're out of the sunlight, they can persist for a long period of time. And they're primarily of condensed aromatic origin. If we take biomass, burn it, we produce charcoal that produces more BPCAs afterwards. And so the going thought was that really these materials were exclusively from fire. Although over time we are showing, not just in my lab and in others, that this condensed aromatic material is also present, unsurprisingly, in petrogenic sources of organic matter. So a student who's working on shale inputs to the Hudson River, and so he's finding black carbon in those source rocks, and also some projects where we're working on with crude oil sources. So this would be more representative. These BPCAs also represent kind of the asphaltene fractions and things like that. And there's also some thoughts that potentially other hydrothermal sources are a source of these BPCAs. So of course, as we increase our spatiotemporal resolution of data collected with this method, the definition of this method is changing over time. So I'm sure some of you can appreciate that challenge as well. But it's still worth studying because it is this very recalcitrant form of carbon. And we do know that it comes from this charred material, at least in part. So why is it important to study black carbon in these recently burned watersheds? So we've been talking a lot about modeling thus far, and I'm sure these conversations will continue, but these short and long-term black carbon assessments are necessary for accurate models of carbon cycling and for calibration of sedimentary charcoal records. So A lot of folks in the past, well, and currently, have used sedimentary charcoal to infer what happened on the landscape historically. And so we need to be able to understand the mobilization mechanisms of char kind of through time, and we can do that in our modern environment. So this interaction between burn severity, hydrology, proximity to the coast, all affect the record that's in our sediments that we use to kind of reconstruct historic burn events. So it's important to understand the mobilization of this material. Wildfire itself alters the hydrology and geomorphology of an area, which, that's a disturbance event, and it can take variable times to recover and recover in different ways. Also, the interactions between black carbon or organic matter, soils, anything that's on the landscape and water during the first post-fire year is really a critical time for its mobilization and redistribution in the environment. So you have this event, and then capturing the effects of that disturbance event immediately is really important. But sampling efforts, although it's always great to say they should be immediate and early, can be really difficult to do in practice. If your first week was out in the field, it's hard to go storm chasing, it's hard to go fire chasing, it's hard to do both together. So trying to get these data is a real challenge in and of itself. So the summer of 2020, we actually had opportunities fall into our laps to actually go out and chase some of these firestorm events. So summer of 2020 was an extremely active wildfire season for California. I'm showing kind of the burn scars for the two that I'm going to be talking about today. One is the CCU lightning complex fire in that coastal area, and then the Santa Clara unit lightning complex fire, which burned a larger area, kind of a little bit more inland. And so the first study I'm going to talk about, these are active ongoing projects that are mainly led by my graduate student, Riley. And so what she's been looking at is kind of the effects of these fire in little headwater streams at this Blue Oak Branch Reserve site. So these are very, very small watersheds. The fire itself is a relatively low severity fire. So of course, we see in the news a lot of big events, huge, massive amounts of erosion, but this is more of a light burn, which is going to have a very different effect on material export post-fire. And also the streams there are non-perennial, so they only flow part of the year. We also have another project that's happening in these more coastal watersheds just north of Santa Cruz, and the CCU lightning complex fire was more severe, and the streams that we're interested in studying, or that we are studying here, are perennial, so they flow throughout the year. They are larger, and this particular fire was of a higher severity. So this is not taken at our sampling site that I know of, but it gives you an idea of just kind of the visual difference between a lower severity and a high severity fire. So the first site is at this Blue Oak Ranch Reserve, which is an experimental research site. So my collaborator, Margaret Zimmer, and her graduate student, were already monitoring hydrologic flow patch. They're hydrologists, so we kind of came together to evaluate material export after this Santa Clara unit lightning complex fire. This is the watershed, the paired watersheds that we've been working in. And so this is North Star Canyon and South Star Canyon. They are similar in size, but they vary in their hydrology and their geomorphology. So North Star Canyon is a bit steeper, it has a thinner critical zone, and if you can, you can see it. If you look at the hydrograph, it has a much flashier hydrology. Its discharge will be higher usually during storm events than at South Star Canyon, which is relatively more flat, as a thicker critical zone, and it's much slower to dry down. So really, these are very similar areas. They were burned at a similar severity. And both of the watersheds were burned in total, but their hydrologies vary. And so it was really kind of a nice opportunity to study material export immediately after fires in these two slightly different watersheds. So our main research objective here was to assess the temporal evolution of black carbon export in stream from this first post-fire flush through summer dry down, although we do have samples from year 2. I'm not showing that data today. So again, to kind of transport you to the fire location, this is what the hill slopes of the watershed looked like. And so you can see this is right after the fire. There's a lot of ash deposition. But if you look at the image on the right, this is not, we were just talking about crown fires. This is not one of these high severity burns where the entire tree goes up in flames. this really was mostly a ground fire, a lot of shrub and low-lying vegetation was affected, but you didn't see these like major massive erosion events or removal of large vegetation that you might see in a higher severity burn. So this is some pictures of our streams here, and this is an image of our graduate student collaborator, Lauren Biggie, who's out at UC Santa Cruz. And so you can see they're quite small. Here's photos taken when they were actually flowing. You can see the hill slope is quite steep, but this is kind of to give you a sense of what these streams look like. So they're very, very small compared to maybe some other wildfire studies you might be more familiar with. So I want to show, I'm going to be showing a couple of these images for this project where in brown is a hydrograph for both North Dark Canyon and South Dark Canyon. The green circles is black carbon or carbon export in South Dark Canyon, and the triangles are carbon export in North Dark Canyon. And so on these first two panels, I'm showing that dissolved organic carbon concentrations and dissolved black carbon concentrations for these two different watersheds. And really what you can see is that during this kind of little blip of a, well, it shows it as a blip on the hydrograph, is that there's a huge variation in DOC concentration and dissolved black carbon concentration just in this very small like initial wet up period. It was dry prior to this initial storm event. So it was highly variable, which was sort of a surprise, but we don't have pre-fire DOC data for this, so another limitation, but it was interesting to see such large variation with such a small change in the hydrograph. What we typically see for dissolved components is what you would see for kind of this, this kind of secondary storm event here, which was quite large. It was the largest of this first sampling year. And what you can see is that as discharge increases, you also have an increase in DOC and a concomitant increase in dissolved black carbon as well, which is pretty common for black carbon export, dissolved black carbon export in watersheds. And so you can see that the DOC and dissolved black carbon in general, those trends are pretty similar to one another throughout this first year, but perhaps maybe that high variability during that first kind of baby storm event was evidence of dissolution of this fresh char. We know that when you burn material, charcoal can leach a lot of fresh dissolved black carbon, so perhaps that's what's happening here. We can't say for sure, but that's kind of a hypothesis. And so both DOC and dissolved black carbon are more tightly coupled to stream hydrology. And so when you see, when you have a flashier stream, you're gonna have much higher concentrations of this material coming out. Now I'm showing a graph with the same hydrographs, but these are particulate black carbon concentrations, so the stuff that sticks on the filter after you collect and filter your sample. And so what you can see is in general, concentrations are quite low, much lower than dissolved black carbon. So most of this condensed aromatic material is mobilized in the dissolved phase, and much less of it was being mobilized in the particulate phase. But when it was, it had to occur during these higher velocities, higher stream velocities. And so you need like a certain amount of energy to pick up that material and carry it further downstream. So right here, we're seeing very different mechanisms for material export in the dissolved phase and the particulate phase, which is not surprising, but it's unusual to have these paired analyses, particularly for black carbon and burned watersheds. There aren't that many studies out there on this yet. So we're just trying any new sample set or any new data that we can produce on this is great because it's adding to our knowledge in this area. So I want to shift over a little bit to the location of the CCU lightning complex fires. So this was, we collected samples from several watersheds, 5 watersheds in this coastal area. And so as you can see, this is a much more high intensity burn. And the watershed outlines are shown here. Some of them were burned to a high extent, to a 100% burn area. Some of them were at a lower extent. But samples were collected at each of these locations or within each of these watersheds at the same time. So we really get to see how fire severity will impact carbon and black carbon export in these watersheds. So we wanted to see whether watershed burn area or hydrology had a greater effect on post-fire black carbon and charcoal export. And so again, I'm just re-showing this image. So this is an example of a more higher severity burn site. So again, I'm gonna keep this map up so you can hopefully like compare and contrast, but on the x-axis here, I'm showing the watershed burn extent for each of these watersheds. I also recognize that there is a size effect that is here, but again, we're trying to take opportunistic samples and tease out some kind of cause and effect relationships. But what we're seeing here is, in short, both dissolved organic carbon and dissolved black carbon, there seem to be no effect of watershed burn extent on the export of this material in the dissolved phase. There's a lot of carbon in soils, there's a lot of historic black carbon in soils, and so it just seems like watershed burn extent alone did not impact the movement of this material post-fire. Again, we don't have pre-fire data for this. For particulate black carbon, for POC and PDC trends, so particulate organic carbon and particulate black carbon trends kind of mimicked one another, but again, they're kind of had an unclear effect of watershed burn extent had an unclear effect on the mobilization of this material as well. Some of them we can account for, this Pescadero site, which is these kind of yellow triangles. We're pretty sure that there's a dam upstream that's preventing the mobilization of particulate material, which is why we have really low particulate concentrations. But again, this just continues to illustrate the challenge of trying to predict material export in fire affected watersheds, even when we think we have a really good like representative sampling of it. Larry mentioned catchment size. So, so we kind of are taking the same data here and kind of resorting it, not by by watershed, but also binning these data by kind of flow regime. So we categorize the samples that were collected at base flow, low flow, or high flow, so during some of these larger storm events. And so in general, you can see that dissolved black carbon concentrations increase with discharge. Again, we saw that in the previous project. But particulate black carbon, this is where we see an effect of hydrology, not so much burn extent. So here at these really, really high flow rates, you're having the mobilization of particulate black carbon, but looking at the error bars, there is a lot of variability there. So in this kind of taking both of these studies together, there are definitely different mobilization mechanisms for particulate char versus dissolved black carbon, and it seems like there's kind of a tipping point in terms of hydrology where you need to have enough energy to pick up and mobilize that particular material, whereas you have continuous export of dissolved black carbon and of course DOC during kind of any hydrological conditions, but it increases with increased charge in general. So as part of this, I've been sort of adding to this kind of global relationship between dissolved organic carbon and dissolved black carbon. And so previous work by my PhD advisor, Rudolph, and his co-authors at the time, they really looked at kind of this global relationship between dissolved organic carbon and dissolved black carbon. And so I pulled out just their headwater data. And so this was kind of our current understanding of dissolved black carbon and DOC export in headwaters. If we add in some of our more recent studies, so I'm adding kind of data from these two studies, the green circles and the orange triangles, and including some data from kind of one of my PhD projects that I had it readily available. But what we can see here is that dissolved black carbon concentrations are an order of magnitude higher than what we expected. I guess we got those for DOC too, in some of these fire-affected headwaters, so that kind of is transforming our idea of what's going on here. And if we kind of put in this relationship for global rivers, we can see that the proportionally dissolved black carbon comprises a much lower percentage of both DOC, and that it's much more variable than expected in some of these headwater streams. So this variability is maybe describing some of the inherent heterogeneity and complexity that's going on in some of these watersheds. So I just keep adding to this, revisiting this idea to help us try and understand and perhaps, assess the utility of using something like DOC as a mechanism for scaling dissolved black carbon. So to kind of summarize all of this, we're really trying to target some of these fine scale processes for representing black carbon, but also organic carbon cycling and first system models. And so this is just a little image from a recent paper which kind of describes all of these landscape processes that would eventually affect the movement of dissolved black carbon, particulate black carbon, and just carbon and other material in general from the burn landscape to coastal waters. And there's a lot of questions. So we have a lot of question marks there. So this is really an area that's ripe for more data collection. We have very limited understanding about how each of these kind of more regional or fine scale processes are affecting carbon export. And it's really important to constrain these so that we can understand how black carbon and organic material is redistributed along this continuum, and to determine the true role of wildfires as our planet continues to change in the Earth system. So there's a review paper on that, and I think I'm out of time, so I just want to say thank you.
Very much. I see a hand for question.
That was a great talk, I enjoyed it. When you guys sampled the Santa Clara unit, did you by chance sample any control streams that weren't burned?
We did not. It was honestly limited by personnel. It was funded by a rapid. We just did not have enough people to go out and collect this. So we don't have an unburned watershed, and we had considered actually sampling from an unburned watershed, but the geology and the hydrology of that watershed was substantially different than the ones that we were going to be studying. So it was, if we did collect it, it would be kind of comparing apples and oranges again, because you're looking at this unburned site, and it's kind of basic geomorphic metrics are different than the ones that we're trying to analyze. So it was a limitation, but no, we don't have unburned site.
Thank you.
For those headwater stream samplings after storms, is your assumption that most of that is modern black carbon? Or if you went there the year before and sampled the rain, so you get the same amount of black carbon?
So we're kind of working at the data for year 2, so I think we might be able to, and we're still working on hydrologic data, so I think the relationship between discharge and GBC export will indicate that. But my guess is if you went there the year prior, years prior, this is a landscape that is not new to fire, so I would expect to have similar DBC export pre-fire. It's the particulate story that I think really changes a lot more with more recent fire events. So yeah.
Thanks, Sasha. Great talk. Kevin Ryan, USGS. Just a quick question. I might miss it in the methods. Particulate organic matter measurement. What percentage is particulate black carbon on those filters, and how do you distinguish that? Yeah.
PVC to POC.
Yeah, using your acronyms.
Organic.
Particulate black carbon.
Yep.
What percentage is particulate black carbon of PON?
Organic matter.
Is it soil organic matter mixed in equally with the black carbon that's just recently burnt, or how do you distinguish that?
I think it's a fairly low percentage. I would have to go back and more take time now, so we can look at the data later. But I think it's a fairly low percentage, and probably I think it's, if I'm remembering correctly, it's a much lower percentage than the dissolve phase. So it's probably just a couple of percent rather than a huge amount, at least for these storm events in this relation.
Sorry, Sasha, one more question. Signature. Could you go back to the graph where you had the global data? So the black squares, are those some of the work that in that Jaffe paper?
Yes.
Why do you think that the global river DEC or DOC is higher than the definite fire watersheds?
So I think, as I mentioned, we're kind of revising our understanding of what BPCs are measuring for sure. But I would say, since we are quantifying this fire refractory portion of organic carbon, probably what's happening is in headwater streams, burned or unburned, you're having a lot of fresh DOC coming out. And then based on like river continuum concept principles, you're having a lot of degradation of that really labile DOC happening along river networks. And by the time most of these global rivers, the black squares, they were collected at very large river mouths. So the organic carbon that's being exported there has already undergone some degree of degradation, especially if the source is from fire affected headwaters for sure. So I think, and even though fire produces black carbon, not all of it is soluble right away. We can get into a lot of the details of it, but certainly whatever is mobilized will stick around preferentially as that other more labile DOC is degraded. So that's probably why you're seeing an increase there. That's just a hypothesis, but that's kind of my current hypothesis.
Great talk, Sasha. This is Carl from Texas A&M. Do you think like solubility controls export as well? And, like not just how much is there, but you might reach a threshold that kind of, that once you dissolve volatile materials.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. So this is kind of going into like experimental leaching experiments that both I've done and photo dissolution experiments that I know Al and I have worked on together. But you can have, if you take, depending on the charcoal type and the burning conditions, it will have very different solubilities in terms of black carbon mobilization. Because if you think about fresh char, you're creating these really hydrophobic molecules. And so actually, like one of the charcoal standards that we use for like chestnut wood that was burned under certain conditions, it actually leaches very little dissolved black carbon and DOC. It's a black powder, but it leaches very little. But you can have different biomass sources that when burned, like more grassy material, that when you burn, it'll leach a lot more. So I think there is something like that, which might explain kind of this delayed release of condensed aromatic structures of any kind from soil. So you need to oxidize, enhance the solubility in order for it to even go into solution and be mobilized. So it's kind of all these things acting together. But yeah, I think that totally plays a role in this as well.
So we will invite Erin and Sasha back up here for some more discussion.
So I guess it's also a comment and a question for sort of broad theme of what we'll be dealing with in the next few days. And that is, when you think about these fire communities, plant communities, are you starting to, or are people starting to think about incorporating sort of the adaptive evolutionary strategies on plants and systems that have been over a decade now in terms of fire resistance in trees and even understory, and how that fits with how we think about predictive models of what export of soils or export of carbon or whatever. Because as you start having this more adaptive change and even range expansion, those things are happening in real time now, much faster way than I think biologists do.
Yep.
Oh, okay. So one thing that I've done a little bit of is just thinking about different reproductive strategies and how those influence export following fire. So what comes back and how does that influence things like nitrogen uptake? I've seen, in a lot of chaparral ecosystems, we have resprouters versus reseeders. So things that come back from seedlings versus sprouting from a whole around with no tuber, and that can have a huge effect on the amounts of solutes that are being exported, because if you have already this large sort of root network, you can multiply or certainly take up a lot more ends. So in terms of like an evolutionary response to fire, there certainly are people who are studying that and thinking about different strategies in different ecosystems. The extent to which that has been incorporated in some models, I think is somewhat limited. Some of these process-based models don't do a great job of simulating sort of a change in vegetation cover or ecophysiological changes, and you kind of parameterize a given vegetation type. So does that kind of get at your question?
Yeah, no, that is. I mean, I guess one of the things is that where I thought about this was that I guess lightning strikes and really changing the community composition of the Amazon down different trees disappear. So anyway, along those lines, but I just think it's something that our committee talked about in terms of either these motivations for selecting some effects recently, hurricane versus ones that have had more systematically received community response seen, and whether that needs to be involved. So it's a question that a broader statement, sorry.
Really quickly, I'll just add that, we're seeing a lot of vegetation community shifts in burn ecosystems and thinking about ways to better represent that. And there are great models out there that can capture shifting vegetation. The extent to which we couple those with these process-based biogeochemical models, there's lots of room for improvement there. But that's a really important process, controlling how export is going to change in the future.
Roy Johnson from PMM. This is a partly heuristic question for my next family reunion, but this is something I've been thinking about as well. Like, have you guys thought about, or are people looking at the kind of contrasting the effect of fires, because nutrient fluxes and DOM fluxes to clear cuttings? Because I'm from Sweden, where basically we have forest gardens, like we clear cut the country every 40 years or so. So we don't really have forest fires, because we cut down everything before they get grew up enough to be burned. So is there, how much of a difference is there, and how should we think about that, those two ways of disturbance in forests?
I haven't looked at any data or worked with any statistics or read any. So clear cutting, there's no fire related, I'm assuming it's just. So I would imagine in some ways the processes could be similar because you're really doing a lot of above ground vegetation, but you're not really. I don't know if the soil layer would be disturbed maybe over a longer time period as you're, peeling off the larger vegetation, might eventually destabilize roots and associated soil.
Forest clouds.
Oh, clouds. Okay, so they're like pulling up. Okay, so then maybe it is more similar then. So I guess the difference is, maybe you're not having a thermal alteration and maybe release of nutrients, or at least from the DOC perspective, we've seen in low severity versus high severity fires that kind of the release of DOC can be very variable. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down, and sometimes it doesn't really change. And it has to do with the thermal alteration of the soils or the biomass that is there. And then of course, like the period of time between burning and rain and the type of rain, things like that. So I would imagine that you probably would have to increase erosion with just kind of there would be no ash or charcoal, which will certainly have some effect, but to predict that, I'm not sure what exactly it would look like, but you certainly have probably.
I'll just add to that, sort of related, but I also haven't seen clear cutting, but a lot of people are interested in this trade-off between forest management and fire, and whether managing a forest and doing thinning or prescribed burns will ultimately reduce the total amount of DOC that is being exported. And there's some really interesting theoretical studies by Dale Johnson looking at where he sort of proposes this idea that fire suppression is leading to more total DOC export than if you allowed low severity fires to burn in an ecosystem. So that's like a perfect question for modeling studies, if they're able to capture some of those physical processes. And so there are people working on that from a forest management perspective, and it either depends on where, when, what the climate's like, and so on.
Elliot White, Stanford University again. Trying to get to the synthesis aspect of the previous stuff about hurricanes and now this, and you all mentioned the importance of water events post-fire, and thinking about the history of fire suppression in the Southeast. Can you all just kind of comment on how those things will all start to clash together in your journey now?
So we're talking about increased storm events, increased fire events. So you're talking about the Southeast, which is actually, I think the Southeast of the United States, actually in terms of fire management, does a fairly good job, at least better than maybe the Western United States. Also different topography, but I was, the thing about what, so most of our studies are based out of the Western United States, which has very different vegetation and very a long history of fire suppression, which now you're igniting a lot of these very large trees, very flammable trees. So it's just a different, southeastern fires, I think are very different than western fires for sure. Trying to think how they would all come together. If we had, I guess in general, you would, if fires stayed the same in the southeast, you had more intense storm events coming in, you would probably have a lot more of that material being mobilized out quicker. But then at least when I think about charcoal mobilization, it's like, where does it go? If it's not eating microbial communities, it might just be deposited and there for a while, which in terms of but I don't know how like actually come to a synthesis. I think that's the clue with this whole workshop.
So this is not answering your question, but thinking about the earlier talks and one place from a Western North American perspective is there's this projected increase in rainfall intermittency, so longer dry periods with more intense storms. And I think there's a lot of potential for those two things to come together and lead to much larger pulses of material being exported to streams and watersheds. That's an area that people are actively studying and thinking about improving modeling, or both theoretical and process-based models to better capture.
Question Sasha, like the samples, even to serve site, like the firefighters who fight fires, they for some chemicals, does it have an effect on the signal, but also the distribution?
That's a good question. I've actually never studied some. We try to avoid those sites specifically. Slow sites if they were in areas where chemicals were applied, so materials and things that might be supplied. I know in the first kind of study, these little headwater streams, those were not treated. At least where we were studying, it's a relatively small site and it's an experimental field site, so and it was a low severity burn, so they just kind of like we went out after, well, I did it, but graders went out afterwards, and but for the coastal watersheds, I'm not sure if they treated it. It depends. Maybe for bulk DOC, you might be able to see some input from the chemicals that they would apply. I'm showing my ignorance here is exactly what kind of chemicals those are and whether they would show up as part of the DOC pool. It's unlikely that they would show part of the black carbon signature that I'm measuring here. So that's unlikely. But yeah, that's a really good question. And
Hey, this is John Kamenetsky from FIU. I liked the synthesis question that Elliot was grappling with in the Southeast relationship. One of the things, as y'all know, the Everglades has a great fire history, fire management, as you were saying, Sasha, and Southeast in general, but in the Everglades. One of the things that we see is that soil nitrogen and soil carbon are more related to wetland hydro periods. So phosphorus is related to fire return intervals, and there's like a 2 to 15 year return sweet spot where you can capture more P localized. And it got me thinking about probably a cool interaction would be to, those images that Erin showed with these massive teleconnections of smoke and ash, and sort of like inter-basin transfers of ash relative to what we can learn from more contained fires and what's happening within the basin. And I think there's just a lot of carbon signature, nutrient signature, human, materials, houses, et cetera, plastic that could really be important to start to begin to model and understand better.
So something I didn't talk about is like ash deposition, the atmospheric ash deposition today, but I've done some work actually. The effects of the Thomas fire on black carbon deposition and then things in the coastal environment. So it's really led me to think a lot about fertilization of coastal environments, which Erin had touched on as well. But I'm talking about the Everglades system. which is extremely, well, it's autotrophic, so it's, I wouldn't surprise me, I guess, to see that, phosphorus is where you're gonna see that, so, yeah, I think that's a really cool perspective, and I think it's an interesting place to look at specifically phosphorus and positioning for the biogeochemical enzyme. But yeah, and do you know, well, okay, great. Maybe we could chat later, but I'm thinking about food transport and for controlled burns, I would imagine that food would be a lot smaller, but I mean, I see pictures. I follow a lot of Everglades accounts on Instagram.
Yeah.
And so, you see these big plumes, and so they're depositing in other areas, and so, yeah, I would definitely.
Tying into the question on the southeast fires, especially the sugarcane belt and the Louisiana, how spread the fires every year. So what is the type of the black carbon that is produced in the agriculture fires compared to the natural fires? And also, once these agriculture fires are burned, nitrogen, there's a lot more metals and pesticides that we can burn. So what is the type of runoff that is going? Because especially the southeast region is the impact on.
So to kind of address the question about the type of black carbon and how much is produced from sugarcane fires, I don't know exactly, but if I'm just going to emphasize here, I do know from kind of some of our leaching experiments that more grassy type biomass, which I guess I would put sugarcane under that umbrella, rather compared to like more woody biomass, like that. You usually don't produce as much black carbon kind of under the same burn conditions if you go for a very woody type biomass. So a lot more of that biomass during the charring is converted to carbon dioxide as black carbons or charcoal. So you might have less deposition period, or like proportionally less deposition, but if you're burning a huge area, depending on kind of the hydrologic conditions of that area, you can accumulate a lot more. So like globally, grasslands are burned, the area of grasslands is burned is proportionally more than forested areas. So it might be less in terms of proportion of black carbon produced, but depending on the area that's being burned, it could be a really important source. And in terms of solubility, again, thinking about kind of grassy versus woody chars, usually grassy chars, at least in my personal experience, they leach a lot more organic than woody chars. So I would imagine that stuff that is produced probably leaches out a lot more.
Yeah, also geological for Finland. Kind of touching upon the long-term carbon balance of these wildfires. When you have these events, you emit massive amounts of CO2, of course, but you still produce these charcoal and black carbon that's probably sitting there for 1,000 years. But in the meantime, you still have your shrubs and trees growing back and maybe binding some of that CO2 back. So is there any, or there are some studies about how this long-term net effect of carbon is looking like?
Yeah, so there's actually a really good paper I can share with you later by Nat Jones, who really, a lot of his work has focused on this very question. So taking a global perspective, looking at like forested, very crudely kind of forested versus grassy areas.